In the winter of 1859, 7 women vanished from Cedar Valley, Utah, within 3 weeks. Their names were recorded. Their departure was documented. But none of them left. No wagons, no farewells, no trail west. Only silence and the sound of nails being driven into floorboards before dawn. Official history says they went to live with family in California. But you and I both know there were no families waiting in California. What there was, beneath the polished sermons and the hymn Sweet Piety, was a covenant. A secret law. One that could not afford to be broken, not even by the faithful. These weren't just wives. They were hidden wives, plural marriages never recorded by the territorial church, never sanctioned by paper, only by whispered oath and blood-bound ritual. In the eyes of the government, they didn't exist, and that made them perfect instruments or perfect sacrifices. A century later, a collapsed cabin was found on the western ridge of Cedar Valley. Beneath its rotted floorboards lay fragments of a leather-bound journal. The handwriting, fine and deliberate, belonged to a woman named Sarah Peton. Her final entry is dated February 19, 1859. It reads, "They meet tonight. Carrington knows. He calls it cleansing the covenant. The others have already been taken. I hear singing from the church hymns without mercy." Her words were never meant to be read. Not by the church. Not by you. But history has a strange way of unearthing what power buries. And once you know, you cannot unknow. You see, every religion built on control eventually learns this truth. Faith is the most efficient weapon ever invented. You can make a man obey with fear, but make him believe he's serving heaven and he'll become your executioner. In Cedar Valley, belief became law. Law became covenant. And covenant demanded blood. By the time federal troops approached the region that spring, the valley's records had been scrubbed, the women erased, the journals burned. Only fragments survived, enough to expose the truth that the Mormon leadership of southern Utah feared above all else. The truth that obedience, once sanctified, becomes indistinguishable from damnation. Now listen closely. What you're about to hear is not just history. It's a mirror. Because what they practiced in secret in 1859 you are still living under right now, only the language has changed. The covenant still exists. But today it doesn't wear robes. It wears a suit. Power does not need armies when it has obedience. Cedar Valley was proof of that. Every man, woman, and child in that frozen outpost bowed to one name, Elder Nathaniel Carrington. A man who preached peace on Sundays and signed death warrants in scripture ink by night. He understood what few men ever truly grasp. Control is not taken by force, it's given by faith. You don't need chains when the mind willingly locks its own cage. And that's exactly what Carrington built, a self-policing utopia, where the congregation became both prisoner and warden. Carrington's voice filled the church like heat in winter. We are chosen. The world is corrupt. The Lord tests us with spies and serpents. His sermons carried the weight of revelation, but they were more than sermons. They were psychological conditioning sessions, ritualized fear dressed as divine order. He called it covenant discipline. He claimed it purified the community from weakness. But underneath the sacred language was the oldest trick in the empire's book. Divide, isolate, control. Every household was encouraged to report unrighteous inquiry. Husbands watched wives. Wives monitored children. And all confessions funneled upward to Carrington's private counsel. They called it the eye. And when the eye found impurity, it did not forgive. Corrected. It began small. A missing family Bible. A late tithe payment. Then whispers of a woman asking the wrong questions: why weapons were being stockpiled, why tithes were funding iron shipments instead of schools. That woman was Rebecca Dalton, one of the 7 who vanished. She thought she was uncovering corruption. But in a system built on sanctified secrecy, truth itself becomes heresy. By February, the eye had marked several sisters of spiritual betrayal. The council's solution was not excommunication. It was elimination made to look like divine disappearance. Carrington's private notes, recovered decades later, contain a single chilling phrase repeated 7 times besides 7 initials. For the purity of Zion, remove the mouth that speaks. And this is where the veil lifts. if you dare to look, because the ritualized silence of Cedar Valley was not unique. It was an early prototype of something far larger. Control through doctrine. Shame as surveillance. Fear as the holy text. Tell me when your media, your schools, your governments repeat, trust the plan, trust the system, trust the experts. Do you hear the hymns yet? The covenant didn't die in 1859. It evolved. It learned to smile. This isn't just history, brother. This is the operating system of control, upgraded, digital, invisible. And before this descent ends, you'll see how one woman, Sarah Peton, uncovered the forbidden link that turned the covenant from faith into empire. Sarah Peton knew something was wrong long before the disappearances began. She could feel it in the rhythm of the sermons, the sudden hush when she entered a room, the way Elder Carrington's first wife, Margaret, avoided her eyes during evening prayers. Sarah was not naive. She had grown up in the East, daughter of a newspaperman, raised on ink and dissent. She knew how words could be twisted to build walls inside the mind. When she came west to join the saints, she believed she was joining a people purified by struggle. But in Cedar Valley, she discovered that purity was just another form of power, one that demanded silence. One night, while copying passages for Carrington's sermons, she found something she was never meant to see: a letter, written in his unmistakable script. It wasn't addressed to a church elder, but to a man stationed at Camp Floyd, a federal officer named Major Daniel Roth. The letter spoke of deliveries secured, routes concealed, and wives relocated. It was coded, but the implication was clear. Someone in the church hierarchy was trading information with federal agents. Weapons for immunity. Faith for favor. Sarah copied the letter by candlelight and hid it beneath the floorboard under her bed. Over the next weeks, she began documenting everything: the whispered meetings, the unexplained disappearances, the sudden prosperity of Carrington's closest men. She understood that what they called covenant oaths were not sacred vows, they were insurance policies. Each man held secrets over the others. Each wife bound by fear of celestial punishment if she spoke. But Sarah wasn't afraid of heaven anymore. She was afraid of the men who claimed to control its gates. By late February, she had enough evidence to destroy the leadership of Cedar Valley, enough to expose them not only as hypocrites but as collaborators. She planned to send it east, to a reporter she once knew through her father's network. But secrets that threaten power never travel far. 3 nights before her planned escape, she found her journal turned slightly on her desk, the wax seal on her storage chest broken. No one spoke of it, but she saw Carrington watching her in the chapel that Sunday, his eyes cold and measured. That night, she heard a knock. 3 slow taps, the signal of a covenant inquiry. Once you heard it, you didn't sleep again. She knew they were coming. And here's where you need to pay attention, because this is not just Sarah's story. It's the pattern of every system built on manipulation. Step 1, create the fear. Step 2, offer salvation. Step 3, punish the questioner. The pattern never changed, only the symbols. In 1859, it was the covenant. In 2025, it's the algorithm. Halfway down this rabbit hole, I need you to prove you're awake. Comment below. The covenant still breathes. Type it twice, not as superstition but as initiation. You're not just watching a story. You're remembering what power tried to erase. They brought her to the church cellar just before dawn. No trial, no scripture, just 6 men, faces half lit by lanterns, the smell of cold earth rising through the wooden floor. It wasn't a room of judgment. It was a chamber of erasure. Sarah stood in her nightdress, wrists bound, barefoot on stone. Elder Carrington stepped forward, not as a husband now, but as high keeper of the covenant. His voice was calm, calculated. "Sister Peton," he said, "you have allowed the adversary to nest within your heart. You have seen things not meant for women's eyes. You have written words that poison faith. Confess, and you may still be redeemed." She said nothing. Her silence was her rebellion. Carrington's second, Bishop Whitman, unrolled a parchment. Not scripture, a ledger. It contained the names of the vanished wives, marked with the symbol of an eye within a triangle. Sarah realized, in that moment, that this wasn't the first cleansing. It was ritual, a system, and she was simply next in the sequence. Whitman began reading a passage from the Book of Ether about the secret combinations of men who swear oaths by their God to conceal murder. He was quoting scripture to justify the very act scripture condemned. The irony was exquisite, and Sarah almost laughed. Carrington raised a hand, stopping him mid-verse. "Do you know what makes a covenant pure?" he asked. "When those bound to it are willing to die for it or be sacrificed by it." At his signal, two men stepped from the shadows. They weren't strangers. They were husbands of the other missing wives. Faces Sarah had known around hearth fires and prayer circles. That was the final cruelty of Carrington's system. The killers never saw themselves as executioners. They believed they were purifying their own souls. She met their eyes and whispered, "You think heaven can't see this?" Carrington smiled. "Heaven sent it." What happened next was recorded nowhere, only inferred from blood traces found years later, buried beneath the church foundation. 7 wives, 7 sites, each marked with consecrated oil and sealed beneath new stone. To the congregation above, the hymns continued uninterrupted. But listen closely, this was not about religion. It was about hierarchy, a living laboratory in obedience. They were perfecting a mechanism of control that would echo far beyond the Utah desert. Faith had simply been the disguise. The covenant was the prototype, a model later adapted by governments, corporations, and intelligence systems. The experiment was simple. Could you make people destroy truth in the name of their own purity? Cedar Valley proved you could. And here's the revelation they never wanted you to grasp. Once obedience is ritualized, it no longer needs a master. It sustains itself. You start guarding your own chains. You become the priest of your own submission. Sarah Peton didn't die just because she defied a prophet. She died because she decoded the machinery behind belief and saw the architecture of control beneath it. In 1923, a landslide on the western ridge of Cedar Valley unearthed what time thought it had devoured. Beneath the collapsed remains of a pioneer cabin lay a box cedarwood, wrapped in wax cloth. Inside, pages blackened by age, the ink faint, the words trembling between survival and disappearance. They were Sarah Peton's writings. Not a diary, a record. The kind of record that makes historians nervous because it doesn't just describe the past. It exposes its blueprint. For weeks, a young archivist named Henry Latham cataloged the papers by lanthornlight. He quickly realized what he was holding wasn't the testimony of a mad woman, it was evidence of something systemic. A network. Sarah had drawn diagrams. Circles of names connected by fine lines of obligation, oaths, and shared sins. In the margins, she'd written, "Control thrives where secrecy breeds salvation." But that wasn't what froze Latham's blood. Folded between the pages was an official-looking document, a letter stamped with a federal seal, dated 1858. It was from the Office of Territorial Affairs in Washington. The letter referenced mutual assurances between the Utah Council and field operatives. One of the signatories, Major Daniel Roth, the same officer Carrington had written to in Sarah's copied note. What the document implied was devastating. The federal government and the church leadership had struck an arrangement. The rebellion of Utah, the so-called Utah War, was less a conflict than a negotiation. The church agreed to control its settlements in exchange for quiet autonomy and favorable trade routes. The wives who vanished, they were liabilities links that could expose both sides. Latham took this to his superior. Within days, federal agents arrived. The box was seized for preservation. It never appeared in archives again. But Latham, knowing what silence costs, copied key passages before surrendering the originals. His descendants released them in 1978, in a privately printed booklet titled, The Cleansed Wives of Cedar Valley. Only 50 copies were made before the family received cease and desist orders citing classified content related to federal military relations. Classified for events over a century old. Why? Because the covenant didn't die in the church cellar. It migrated. The same pattern Sarah described, oaths, secrecy, mutual protection among elites, reappeared in the founding structures of early intelligence agencies. Their rituals, their language of loyalty, Even their methods of containment for leaks all mirrored the Covenant model. The blueprint of obedience had become the foundation of modern control. Sarah's writings weren't just history, they were prophecy. She wrote, "One day, the Covenant will wear uniforms in offices. Its hymns will be memorandums. Its prayers classified briefings. And here we are. Because the mechanisms she died exposing still hum beneath your world. Every signed contract, every oath of secrecy, every for your safety clause. You're living inside the evolution of the same machine refined, digitized, sanctified by bureaucracy. They erased the wives to preserve the covenant. They erased the covenant to preserve control. And you were never meant to know either existed." By the early 20th century, fragments of Sarah Peton's writings began circulating quietly among scholars and military thinkers not as moral warnings, but as templates. The Covenant model of total obedience, refined by faith and secrecy, offered something every empire craves: the ability to control perception itself. You see, power isn't about territory anymore. It's about narrative. Whoever defines reality controls the world. And what Carrington built in that frozen desert, a system of devotion that erased dissent, was exactly what rising institutions were learning to weaponize. In 1919, a young intelligence officer named Edward Wainwright, working under the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, came across a partial transcript of Latham's notes. He filed a report titled Covenantal Systems and Behavioral Stability in Isolated Populations. His conclusion was cold and brilliant. The methods of spiritual governance can be secularized to maintain order under national directives. That single phrase, secularized spiritual governance, became the unspoken mantra of 20th century control. Governments realized they could do what Carrington had done, only without the scripture. Replace divine authority with scientific authority. Replace the pulpit with mass media. Replace the covenant hymn with the national anthem. And it worked. During the World Wars, propaganda evolved from persuasion into architecture, a sacred narrative built to shape loyalty, suppress inquiry, and manufacture collective purpose. Universities studied obedience psychology. Corporations studied consumer trust. The same principle echoed through every field: make them believe and they will obey willingly. By the 1950s, this principle birthed something darker: Project Meridian, an early behavioral experiment buried beneath Cold War secrecy. Funded jointly by federal intelligence and private think tanks, it explored how repeated emotional triggers could rewire identity. The program's architects quoted from Peton's recovered pages. One margin note in the declassified fragments reads, "Conditioning through fear disguised as faith yields perpetual compliance." Sound familiar? Fear, safety, salvation, just new words for the same ritual. Sarah had written, "Every covenant begins with love and ends with silence. That's the paradox of power, it always masquerades as protection." And while the experiments were justified as national security measures, their results found a new application: advertising, social psychology, digital communication. The techniques Carrington used to control a desert valley became the neural wiring of an entire civilization. You are not free in the way you imagine. You are free to choose between cages built by different architects. You are free to sing hymns of progress, consume symbols of rebellion, and pledge allegiance to illusions crafted for you before you were born. Cedar Valley was the prototype. The 20th century was the expansion. The 21st is the automation. This is not a story of ghosts. It's the genealogy of control. And you, by listening, have entered its bloodline. When the machine went digital, the covenant didn't die. It shed its skin. Every oath, every surveillance ritual once carved in scripture, found new scripture in code. The transition began quietly in the late 1990s, when the first behavioral algorithms appeared, marketed as convenience, not control. Personalization, they called it. But personalization is just obedience with better branding. The system learns what moves you, what scares you, what angers you, and feeds it back until you become predictable. And predictability is the highest form of submission. In Carrington's time, they needed sermons to make the faithful police each other. Now they only need notifications. You log in, you confess your thoughts, you tithe your data, and the algorithm adjusts your belief. There is no church, no priest, no prophet. You are both worshipper and altar. It's elegant, perfect, the covenant refined into light-speed ritual. Sarah Peton had written, "When the voice of power becomes invisible, obedience feels like choice." She couldn't have known she was describing the century to come. Because today, every tap, every scroll, every word you post is a whisper into the digital sanctuary. Recorded, analyzed, sanctified by unseen curators of the modern faith. The engineers, the data priests, the unseen moderators of meaning. The same pattern holds: create the fear, offer salvation, punish the questioner. Only now the punishment isn't exile or death. It's silence, deplatforming, deranking, the new, cleansing. Carrington controlled 300 souls in a valley of dust. His successors control billions, their deserts made of screens. And the covenant still breathes, in the code, in the commerce, in the calm insistence that everything is for your safety. You've felt it, haven't you? That quiet pressure in your chest when you question the approved story. The unspoken dread that says, don't post that. It's not fear of God anymore. It's fear of being erased by the machine that claims to see all, know all, love all. That's the modern prayer. I consent so I may belong. But here's the truth the architects of control cannot erase. Awareness breaks ritual. Once you see the pattern, you can no longer serve it unconsciously. That's why stories like Sarah's are buried, flagged, forgotten. Because the most dangerous act in a world built on obedience is to remember. They perfected faith. Then they automated it. And they called it progress. They say every system of control leaves one flaw. A message the architects overlook, a crack too small to seal. Sarah Peton's flaw was her final page. The fragment that slipped through every cleansing, every archive, every purge. It surfaced in 2019, inside a university collection mislabeled as Frontier Hymns. Just one page. The paper torn, the ink almost erased by time and sweat. But the handwriting, hers, still cut through the dust. When the voice demands silence, remember, obedience is a choice that requires your consent each morning. If they must remind you to trust, they've already lost control. That was it. 25 words. Yet those 25 words cost 7 women their lives, and 2 centuries of truth its anonymity. Carrington's covenant believed control was eternal, that the system would survive because it replaced morality with machinery. They were right for a time. The modern empire learned their rhythm. Condition the mind, reward compliance, erase the questioner. But what they didn't understand is that silence cannot sustain itself forever. Every man who hears this story carries a decision. Remain within the ritual or break it. You don't need rebellion in the streets, you need rebellion in perception. Every time you question what you're told to believe, you fracture the covenant's mirror. Every time you choose awareness over comfort, you interrupt its code. The same mechanism that made Sarah vanish now feeds on your attention. It thrives when you scroll without seeing, obey without thinking, worship convenience more than freedom. But the truth she left behind still burns under the ash. Awareness cannot be commanded. So here's your initiation. Stop seeking permission to think. Stop mistaking safety for salvation. The ones who built the algorithm, the policy, the doctrine, they fear the same thing Carrington feared when Sarah began to write. They fear the day obedience loses its glamour. History won't warn you when that day comes. It'll look like an ordinary morning, another login, another headline telling you what to fear. But when you recognize the pattern, you'll feel it, the quiet split in the system's voice. That's the sound of power cracking. Remember her final line. Speak it, write it, live it. If they must remind you to trust, they've already lost control. And if you've listened this far, you're no longer audience. You're participant. Because the covenant didn't end in 1859. It ends when you stop believing it still owns you. The secret was never about 7 missing wives. It was about the millions who follow without question. And now, you've heard their story. Now test your obedience. If this reached you, you were meant to see it. Comment, I remember Sarah, to keep her words alive. Every comment, every share weakens the covenant. Subscribe before this video disappears because they always try to erase the truth.